I'm excited to welcome back on the podcast Dr. Christy Kane, who is really one of our go-to therapists in the Leading Saints world. Just a wealth of knowledge that she brings and perspective, has years of experience meeting with individuals and helping them through very, very tricky mental health roads. And I love having Christy Kane on here as a perspective as far as helping leaders better understand some of these mental health dynamics, how we can help, and sometimes things we do with the best intentions that often don't help. Now, this is going to be a great episode to really understand some of these mental health dynamics that church leaders may face or even experience themselves, but also keep your eye on Zion Lab, our online community, because there's some more resources coming up that Christy Kane is going to lead out on to help church leaders better help individuals, especially those who experience some intense mental health dynamics in their life. So sit back, relax, enjoy this conversation. No matter where you are in the world, this is maybe one to listen to a time or two and forward on to others who are striving to minister to people who are struggling with their mental health. So here's my interview with Dr. Christy Kane. Dr. Christy Kane, welcome back to the Leading Saints podcast.
Thank you. Thanks, Kurt. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I always enjoy our conversations, and you're a full-time therapist. How do you explain what you do to people?
I'm not even sure what I do half the time,
right?
So that's a good question. Yes, I am a full-time therapist. I also do a lot of professional speaking across the country. I own 2 clinics now, and
Wow,
I have
right.
a lot of therapists who work for me. I've got one in Lehigh and one in Provo. And so I think I'm a jack of all trade. I've got books published, I do speaking, and I do therapy.
Good stuff. And I always loved, when I interview therapists, I'm always interested to get their current pulse on just mental health in general. Are there any new trends or dynamics you're seeing, or is it just kind of the same mental health
I'll
struggles?
tell you that, the newest concern coming on the horizon is the gray divorce. We are seeing that as an increasing issue, and we're going to be covering that in one of our classes that you and I are going to be talking about today. But yeah, it's interesting. When I was growing up, man, I thought by the time you'd been married 30, 40 years, you had it made, kind of.
Yeah.
And we are seeing increasing numbers of what they refer to as the gray divorce, senior citizens getting divorced. And so that's kind of a new cutting edge issue coming into therapy right now.
And do you see that trend up around like the beginning of the empty nesters, or when all the kids move out, or?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think there's a whole complicated dynamics of the obligatory staying in marriages. And then I think we see lack of essential growth together. And so when they're finally just the two of them, because someone retires, comes back home, whatever, we see a lot of dynamics in inability to relate to each other because they've kind of lived separate lives. So there's a lot of complex issues that we're working on in that dynamic.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, be fun to learn more about that in the future and dive deep, because I'm sure, that's happening in a lot of wards, right? Where, church leaders are, want to just encourage people to continue on in their eternal relationships. But wow, it gets tricky even at the end of life, So.
Yeah, it's a new one. Why is it on the rise now? Because it's not like senior citizens haven't been becoming senior citizens in their marriages for a long time. Right? Yeah. And so it's even looking at what's the dynamics of our culture that's potentially initiating this. And it's not just in the LDS climate. It's across all denominations. It's an interesting issue.
Well, I'm excited to, have this be the beginning of sort of a fun project that we hope to make available to the Leading Saints audience, which, anytime I can get an expert like you to keep sharing your perspective, especially in the context of being a church leader and helping individuals with mental health, I'm always game. And so what's sort of the vision that you see for the direction of some of this content you want to create, and then we can jump into some general concepts that will relate to each one of those.
As we work with so many bishops and estate presidents that refer into our clinic, a lot of what we're recognizing is bishops are striving, and Relief Society president, young women's president, young men, like all the leadership, they desire to help as much as they possibly can. But sometimes they don't know what they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And in that lack of knowledge, they can either re-traumatize the person that they're working with, they can burn themselves out, or they can potentially cross over boundaries that they shouldn't be crossing into.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to create a series for you to have for your audience on different critical mental health topics that we feel leaders need to understand. So, for example, every Wednesday we have an open forum at noon and at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time for anybody to join our virtual meeting. And we talk about critical topics. Like last week, we talked about understanding how shame, guilt, and godly sorrow looks like in the LDS community. Because in the world with Brene Brown, for example, we get the guilt shame discussion, but we don't get to the full transition of godly sorrow, which brings about repentance and change, right?
Yeah.
And so in that class, we were helping leaders understand what shame would look like in a repentance process, because it's not repentance, what guilt would look like in that process, because guilt prepares them to go to the godly sorrow and the transformative process, and how to recognize that and then help clients get out of shame and then use guilt to move into that empowering transitional godly sorrow. So that was one of the topics that we did, and will be one of the topics that we'll be offering.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it is tricky as a church leader. I remember being a bishop you see your list of appointments for that night, and man, I don't know if somebody, sometimes I would breathe a sigh of relief when they'd say, "Oh, I'm here for an ecclesiastical endorsement." I'm like, "Oh, good. All right. Well, I can do that really easy," or it's really daunting, struggles in life and navigating mortality. And, I had the best intentions of being prepared and wanting to say the right things. But like you said, even that dynamic of shame and godly sorrow and guilt, like that's a tough thing to navigate. And sometimes we kind of just clump them all together and and assume they're the same thing and use them equally,
Well, and I appreciate you talking about that, because one of the issues we also talk about is boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Because as leaders in the LDS culture, in a desire to be empathetic and to understand, sometimes if we don't effectively create boundaries, we impact our own mental health, and B, we don't give clear guidelines and direction for members so that they don't necessarily use the leaders as a crutch. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so another thing we talk about is, what do boundaries look like when it comes to interviews, when it comes to providing services, when it comes to allowing members to reach out, but also understand that there are other resources. And so just trying to not only help LDS leaders manage the mental health issues of their members, but also protecting their mental health. And I make a distinction, just so you know, Kurt, when I talk, that mental health is not mental health issues. There's a difference. Mental health is who we are. Mental health issues is when things are going off the rails, and so leaders are sometimes the first to be approached when there are mental health issues.
Yeah.
And oftentimes in a desire to help, boundaries get crossed, and then we end up with some issues that we needed to avoid.
Yeah. I'm curious on your perspective, and correct any of my thinking here, but I think often whether it's the church leader or people outside of that relationship, sort of seeing how the church leader, member relationship works, we often compare the bishop role too closely with maybe a therapist role, when in reality the bishop role is more closely related, almost like a parenting role, where obviously parents aren't professionals. They don't, have the education or the training. However, any youth or even an adult, we would encourage, hey, go talk to your parent. It that because they may be sort of that gateway into further resources or being referred out to professional services and so forth. So I kind of see that leadership role of like, well, no, they're not trying to be a therapist as much as they're trying to just be a gateway to further resources. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy because they're an ecclesiastical minister
Yeah.
and it has its place. What I think is difficult is when members put bishops or other LDS leaders in the role of a therapist.
Yeah.
And that's where it comes back to that boundary place, right? Being able to, as a leader, say, here's where my authority is. This is where my authority ends. And guess what? Here are all of the resources I can refer you to. But so many times they might have resistant members, right? I don't want to go talk to a therapist, or I don't need help. And then pretty soon here's the leader trying to play therapist and the leader and creating kind of a mess that could potentially create more harm than good. Not because it was intended, just because oftentimes the leader's like, well, I don't know what to do because they're refusing to, participate in any of the help that I'm offering. Now, we're getting better in our society of being open-minded to spending time with the mental health professionals, but there's still some dynamics of resistance.
Yeah, because there's all sorts of like barriers there as far as like, they may think, well, can't I just talk with you, my bishop? You're inspired and, you can give me some good guidance, which again, in the spiritual dynamic or the spiritual realm, sure. But, if it's something more complicated in the mental health issue realm that, that's where it's at. Or they may be feeling like, well, I can't afford that. And I don't want to take welfare. I don't want the fast offering funds to go towards my therapy. And so let's just talk or, and then that's when those boundaries get crossed.
Yeah. One of our classes, we talk about recognizing what depression looks like in a spiritual perspective, right? Because oftentimes the fine line will be a member coming in. I don't feel the spirit. I don't feel God's love. I don't believe he hears me. And that can be a spiritual dynamic, but it can also be a depression dynamic because depression can oftentimes create a member's inability to see that God is reaching out. But because the depression, if you will, is sinking the ship, they can't feel that connection. And so we do a training to help bishops understand it's always okay to be curious and refer. Because in appropriate curiosity, not inappropriate curiosity, a member who seems to consistently be unable to recognize the spirit could benefit from just maybe one session with the therapist to analyze if that inability is really due to like dysthymia or major depressive disorder, right? And so just guiding leaders with the right terminology to help members get the right help is important.
Is there more guidance you can give just around the concept of boundaries? I think generally, maybe someone who hasn't been to a lot of therapy doesn't even understand what you're talking about boundaries, or how does that work? And then maybe just a crash course on what are some things a leader can say to, up front, draw some clear boundaries.
Sure. Let's say that hypothetically speaking, a husband comes in to visit with the bishop and he immediately starts the conversation by, my wife's a borderline. She's out of control. She's doing all of these behaviors. The minute a member brings in a mental health perspective, then it's appropriate for the bishop to say, you know what? That's not my wheelhouse. Thank you for sharing with me that there's some struggle in your marriage. We want to help you in your marriage, but we don't know anything about what you're talking about. So let's get you to someone who does, right? So right there's a boundary. It's acknowledging and validating what the person is saying without saying, oh, I'm sure your wife's a borderline. Yeah, no, that's the wrong direction to go, right? You could flip it if, a wife comes in and says, hey, my husband's a narcissist, right? That's where the bishop should not try to say, well, what do you mean they're a narcissist? And what does that look like? No, that's the wrong wheelhouse. That's when it's immediately appropriate to say, you know what? It sounds like there's some complicated things going on in your marriage. I'm not a marriage counselor. I'm here to provide spiritual guidance and support, but you know what? Getting some help is going to be great. If a youth comes in and they're talking about being suicidal, the bishop can immediately say, that's very difficult. We want to keep you safe. I'm not a mental health professional. Suicide is a very serious topic. We need to tell your parents. We need to get you assistance. The other thing on boundaries is important as leaders never to promise something you can't deliver. Never say something like, oh, I promise I'll keep this confidential, because a youth may disclose something that you have to report, that you can't keep confidential, right? So that's a boundary there. So I would say anytime a member touches a mental illness topic, whether it's complications in their marriage, whether it's a mental health perspective, the bishop, the Relief Society president, the Young Women's president needs to validate, recognize that's hard, and then immediately say, let's get you the help you need. I'm going to be here. I'm going to support you, and let's get you into therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can really, as you're referring out to these professional resources, you can just drive the hope train. Like, hey, this gets better. Like there's so many,
Yes.
there's so much help there, and I got you, we're here for you. Let's take the next step. Right. And I guess my mind goes to, cause like you mentioned, like somebody may be interpreting their life of, I'm experiencing a faith crisis. I don't hear God. I don't, life isn't happy, and I do all these things and nothing comes from it. And like you said, this could be, clinical depression happening or some sort of dynamic that way. But if the bishop kind of interprets it like, well, I mean, maybe you're just engaging with your spiritual journey in a way that's less effective, and let's try and fix that. And so sometimes I worry that almost everything can sound like a mental health issue. And maybe there's always some of that to some degree, right?
Mm-hmm. But I think you have to be careful, right? Because just take the example that you gave. Mm-hmm. We have to be so careful that we don't create increased trauma or feelings of unworthiness.
Yeah.
So if someone comes in and says, I'm not feeling the spirit, I'm not this, sometimes in our culture, we might immediately go to, well, are you praying? Are you going to the temple? Are you reading your scriptures? That may seem as benign questions, but if the member is doing that,
right,
then we can imply unworthiness, which we don't intend. And so another way for leaders to think about that is, instead of asking, are you doing questions, saying, tell me more. I love that question. Tell me more about what's going on. Tell me more about what you're doing. And if they answer that question with, I'm doing this and I'm doing that, then there's room to say, you know what? It sounds to me like you're doing all the things that Heavenly Father would ask you to do. So I'm concerned this may be something more. And then if they say, well, I'm not doing those things, then the leader can say, well, how would you feel about doing those? What's been your experience in the past in doing those? Instead of just going straight to, okay, well, start praying and start reading, because they maybe had some negative experiences, right? So without realizing it, we can easily traumatize or reoffend. But if we learn more increased curiosity, information precedes inspiration, right?
Yeah.
And so that's that fine tuning. And so there are going to be spiritual issues, you bet. But when something is persistent, there's a concern that there's an underlying mental health dynamic.
Yeah. And that can be a sign too, right? That it seems like pretty benign what they're dealing with, or let's just meet. But if it feels like nothing's, like progress isn't happening, that might be, well, let's take this to the next level, right?
Yeah, because the other thing about boundaries I forgot to bring up, but oftentimes LDS leaders may have what we call the frequent flyers. Like you can bank that there's someone you're going to see every Sunday or every other Sunday, right?
Yeah.
That's a boundary problem where the leaders got to be able to start setting boundaries and say, okay, I can see you next week, but I've only got 5 minutes. And that way, that helps the leader not burn out. And that also helps set a boundary for the member that says, hey, I'm not your go-to place every time, something's maybe not working out. And so that's appropriate. We have it happen in the therapy world. Like, we have got 3 minutes left in the session, and that's when they drop the bomb. Oh, by the way, right? And so
Yeah.
as young therapists, I train them to say, when it's about 10 minutes left in the therapy session, you need to say, hey, we're going to be done in 10 minutes. Is there anything else you want to talk about, right? LDS leaders can do the same thing with members. Hey, we've just got 5 more minutes, because you can have someone that will take all the time in the world if you don't carefully mind those boundaries.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking of like text messages and phone calls outside of those meetings, right? Where they're reaching
Yep.
out every day or they're several times during the week looking for guidance or help or, you know, uh, and that's the tough thing about boundaries is that it's not like, it's not like I don't know, it can be tough because you want to help the person, right? And you want to be
You
available and you
do.
want to be the bishop who they can pick up the phone and answer. But at the same time, that begins to encroach upon your own life and your family dynamics and things like that. And that's just not healthy, right?
Well, and I think it's part of the reason the church came out with the big self-reliance program, right?
Yeah.
Because if we're always providing the sounding board or the space for them to land, we may be inhibiting growth, or we may be preventing them from digging deeper in a therapeutic role to solve whatever the dynamics is.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said something earlier that I really find helpful is because as a church leader, you can feel so much pressure as you're meeting with this person. You're like, they're walking into my office or I'm going to their home and going to chat with them. And there's sort of this pressure of like, I just need to find the right quote, the right scripture to share. And I want to fix this problem. I want them to be, if they're unhappy right now, I want them to be happy by the time I leave. Right. But the way you frame it is like your mission is to collect as much data as possible. Right. And then you can just ask questions, how's that working for you? Or tell me more about that. Like, oh, what have you tried in the past? Did that really work? Or,
Mm-hmm.
then you're just collecting data and then you can actually do something with that data as far as like, oh, it sounds like we need some help here. Or they may just feel better, because they were actually kind of unload some of this data that they're carrying around and like, oh, wow, thanks, Bishop. This was so good. I'd love to meet again if needed. And, and off you go.
It's kind of like the brother of Jared story, right?
Mm,
Either God made the rocks or we help them find the rocks, right?
yeah.
And if we show up with all the scriptural answers or guidance, it may deny them the struggle, right?
Yeah.
There is growth in a struggle if it's managed appropriately.
Yeah.
And by asking questions, you kind of allow that personal discovery and personal struggle.
Yeah. Another question comes to mind that I feel like is related to this is any advice on like when a leader does refer to a professional therapist, and oftentimes, the bishop is helping fund that with fast offering funds. And so there is this feeling of accountability of I want to make sure that, this is working or that I'm tracking the progress this person is making so I can be of help on the spiritual side as well. And so, often there's these phone calls that happen between a church leader, typically a bishop, and the therapist. And any advice on ways that phone call can go well, or that bishop can leave that phone call being more prepared to help the situation rather than hurt the situation?
You know, part of that depends on if the member will authorize a release, right? So the therapist has to have a signed release to talk to anyone. And so the first step is for the bishop to understand, like, we have a referral form for bishops to use so that they can kind of give us some idea of what their concern is when they refer into us. And then we ask at that beginning of that therapy session if the client would like us to be able to communicate with the bishop so that they sign that release back. And then when we schedule either emails or phone calls with the bishop, and your questions regarding phone calls, it's really important that the therapist that they're referring to has a good grasp of the LDS dogma and the LDS perspectives so that the bishop and the person can be on the same team. They don't necessarily have to be LDS themselves, but that really helps so that when they're talking to the bishop, they're using a similar vernacular. Like, okay, you sent this member to see me. They are indicating that they never feel the Spirit. So here's what we're seeing in our session as to why they're not seeing the spirit. And here's some things we think could be beneficial as you're talking with them. And so part of it is on the mental health provider's responsibility to be able to make sure those ROIs are signed and that they're communicating to the bishop in a way that spiritually the bishop can help, so that we're not making a bishop a therapist. And then the other thing is when the bishop's asking if they can think of specific questions they'd like to ask, that helps the therapist get some direction. Or if the bishop can share something with the therapist that they may not know, because that's what that release of information allows. Oftentimes there may be things that the bishop is privy to that the mental health therapist is not privy to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so both being able to share, both understanding the same vernacular, and really having that release, because if the release is not signed, then the only thing the therapist can do is bill the bishop for the therapy, but they can't communicate any more than that.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Anything else around those topics that before we move on, or do we cover it pretty well?
No, I think it's just learning to be curious and not jumping to conclusions. Oftentimes as leaders, you might feel rushed. There's so much on your plate. There's so much that you're doing. And so holding boundaries will help create the time to do what you need to do. And then just being curious, not jumping to a conclusion. Being so careful with your words. Like I had a client that came in the other day. They're going through a divorce. They went in to meet with their bishop. And the first thing this bishop said to them, not meaning to be offensive in any way, was like, yeah, well, Satan's really happy with your choice. And that just took the member from wanting to talk to that bishop to, I want nothing to do with that bishop, right? And so being curious and like, okay, how did you come to this decision? And how can I support you? And what was happening? What was going on? Then they'll get the answers they need and keep the member open to wanting to receive counsel.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that, that cadence of aiming for curiosity, because, especially in the bishop context, there's sometimes you feel like, oh, I'm supposed to have my judge in Israel hat on right now. And, we got to determine, how serious this or that was, or whether, but when in reality, it's like, we can get to that, in interview 3 or 4, right?
Right.
And for the first couple, I'm just going to remain curious. What happened? And then what happened? Wow. How did you feel about that? Like, at what point did you determine you wanted to come speak to me? Like, and then again, you're just collecting data, and you're really more likely to keep the shame out of the room of, oh my goodness, there's something wrong with you,
Yeah, that's a great word. I'm glad you used that, because if we're not careful, shame comes in and then we've re-traumatized, right?
Yeah, so everything gets more difficult. Just
it does.
Really hard. So
yeah.
Anything about that has been said as far as like these high stake conversations, and having confidence in those high stake conversations when it comes to these mental health dynamics?
Again, I think when the bishop or Relief Society president, or young women or young men president, well, that's the bishop. So anyways, if someone comes into whose ever office or home and they begin talking about something that is immediately recognized as a high risk concern, it's going to be really important for that person to say, you know what, we're going to need to have other people assisting us in this. And I, as a leader, respect you so much that this isn't going to be something that can't be shared, because I want you safe. I want to help you find a solution. Don't imply ever confidentiality in high risk places, because then you're going to negate trust. So if a young person comes in and is talking about self-harming, or they're talking about suicide, the leader should never imply, okay, I'm so glad you shared with me. I won't tell anyone. Thank you for trusting me. No. It needs to be, thank you for trusting me. This is so important. Who else can we involve to get you the help that you need? It's going to be important that we talk to professionals. It's going to be important that we notify so-and-so. all because we love you and all because we care about you. And it's a tricky line because you'll have people that say, well, I'm going to tell you this, but you can't tell anyone. Or I'm going to share this with you, but you have to promise to keep it a secret. And that's when a leader has to be able to say, I just need to tell you up front because I love you. I don't know what you're going to share, but some things I won't be able to keep a secret. And here's kind of the guidelines that I follow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the reality of that risk is they may not tell you, or they may, but then you've been able to keep your authenticity and trust in place.
Yeah. Good.
I think your big bind is especially when you're dealing in a husband and wife situation where, a husband may come in and share something confidentially and ask that you don't tell the wife, or vice versa. One of the things I always tell couples when I'm working with them is I don't keep secrets, because keeping secrets doesn't benefit the relationship. And so one thing LDS leaders can be mindful of is if they have a husband and wife that they're working with, they can set the standard up front and say, hey guys, as I meet with you and as we seek to get you the assistance that you need, just remember this isn't a place for secrets. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a place for trust and openness, and that's where I'm going to lead.
Yeah. Now, and this would include like things outside of because as a therapist, you're what do they call it, a reporter,
mandatory
reporter with situations of abuse and things, right? Which are there things like outside of that, so that you would still want to be clear of not keeping confidential?
Well, if I think a person, especially a youth, is struggling, it's a fine line between keeping that confidentiality and not involving the parents. And that's where you're going to have a lot of prayer and stewardship. Yeah. Because there may be times when it's appropriate not to share. But the risk that you run into is if the parents then find out
right,
that the leader knew and didn't tell them, right? And so that's a really fine balance. I don't have that issue so much in the therapy world because we have rules regarding children under the age of 18 in the therapy process. But in the religious community, oftentimes youth might share something with their leaders. Maybe they're struggling with their mom or with their dad, or maybe they've, been involved intimately with another young person and they don't want their parents to know. Those are difficult places to navigate. And obviously I don't wear the ecclesiastical authority or the calling to direct the spirit there. And so that's when it becomes really important to manage the spirit. But I always think if a leader can do anything to help improve the relationship with the youth and their parents, that's the best avenue to go. But also trusting whether or not, those confidences need to be kept. Because even religious leaders are mandatory reporters, right? So interesting dynamics there.
Yeah. And I would imagine sometimes it's one of those, like, depending on what they're telling you, because as you want to maintain trust with somebody, it's not like, oh, the minute you leave this office, I'm going to tell, your spouse or your parents, whatever. But it's more of like, at some point we need to do that. And if we need to do that slowly and make sure you're comfortable with each step and when you're ready and things, and I just worry that maybe that would scare them off to the point where, well, I'm never going back there and telling them anything,
No, but I would say you need to set the expectations up front.
Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha.
In saying, this is so important. I think, we are going to need to invite your parents when you're ready. And I'm going to be here, so there's just the expectation so that they're preparing for that as well.
Yeah. Really good. We've talked a little bit about as far as like leadership burnout and overfunctioning. Anything else we need to add to that?
Well, it's really important for all leaders to stay in the role that they're sustained in. And the more that leaders can do that, then, so for example, it's not the role of a leader to do financial planning.
Yeah.
That's a referral out, right?
Yeah.
It's not the role of the leader to landscape a person's home, right? That's a refer out. Sometimes our culture will put the professional position of the leader with the hat of the calling. And it's going to be important that religious leaders kind of separate the hats. I had a gentleman I was working with, and he was a doctor and a bishop. And he got calls every hour of the night for medical issues because he was a doctor. And they're like, oh, call the bishop. He can come run over and look at this. And I said, right now you're not a doctor to your ward. You're the bishop to your ward. And you're going to need to create that boundary. Now, it was rather interesting because when he started doing that, people kind of got offended. Like, what do you mean you can't run over at 2:00 in the morning? I'm your bishop. I'm not your doctor, right? And so it's really important to set that up front because the minute you break the boundary, getting it back in is hard.
Yeah, that's for sure. So true. And then anything else with burnout or overfunctioning? I think that those are all just
take self-care, right? Self-care. Go on your date nights, go on your hikes, get your exercise. Like, you are whatever calling you are, but that's not the first calling that you hold, right? We say all the time, you're a son and a daughter of God. Well, your mental health needs constant stability so that you're good at the calling that you hold. So just make sure you keep those in order.
Yeah.
It's kind of keeping your house in order process, right?
Yeah. And I appreciate this, that, when a leader experiences overwhelm or burnout, we often default to this advice of, well, you should delegate more, let other people help you, which is true. However, I think another important component is you need very clear, strong boundaries so that you don't reach that overwhelm level, and if you're reaching
Yes.
that on a regular basis, that's a good indicator that, yeah, maybe there's some things to delegate, but there's probably some stronger boundaries to put in place to help you function,
Yeah. I mean, if you were a runner every morning before you got called to be an LDS leader, make sure you're still a runner every morning.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So,
Yeah. So true. And then lastly, on your outline here is you mentioned strengthens families and word culture. What, how does all this fit in there?
I think the more we can become clear on the spiritual leader dynamics in each one of the organizations, and we hold those, we make it a safer place for people to trust. Because so many times what creates difficulty is when we cross over where we shouldn't and can offend or make further trauma or create further issues. So the more as leaders within the LDS faith, we understand mental health issues, not to be a therapist, but to recognize them so that we can refer where appropriate. And the more we can hold the boundary of our spiritual stewardship, then the more the members are going to seek to bring to that leader that spiritual stewardship side and be able to be more comfortable knowing, well, this is a financial issue. I'm going to go get help here, right? Leaders have such limited spiritual directional time anyways, because most of them we're not a paid ministry. So most of them have a job. Most of them have a family. And so the time that they do have, the more it can be concentrated on that spiritual stewardship guidance, then the more cohesiveness we find in the leadership. And then we don't end up with some of the complicated offenses that happen that oftentimes cause people to step away from the church.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the power of really positive culture, right? That, people are more likely to reach out for help. People are more likely to find resources, sometimes on their own, or make connections that really help their mental health, just makes everybody's job easier, including the leader, when there's that positive culture, and people find a renewing and a connection and so forth when they come to church or engage in their faith community. So,
there's an interesting discussion that goes on, and you're probably aware of this. I'm guessing you've probably done some episodes on this, but there's this strong undercurrent that LDS women feel alone. And yet they're surrounded by other sisters, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so if you think about this process where more and more we're encouraging the sisters to go to the sister leaders, and we're trying to create that more connectiveness, I wonder if we hold the boundaries where they need to be in this process, we can address some of that of feeling alone and not feeling connected as women. It's interesting that they have now that council process in Relief Society trying to help that cohesiveness, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I taught Relief Society a couple Sundays ago, and the talk that I was given was Elder Gong's talk, No One Sits Alone. Now, I'm a divorced single sister in the church, and I had to laugh for a minute because when I got the talk, I was like, well, I sit alone every single Sunday, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought, I shouldn't teach this class. And then I had to take a step back and say, of course I should, because I'm going to bring some different perspectives, right? Yeah. But I love this new guidance of the sister leaders leading the sisters, right? And I think that's going to help with some of that aloneness culture as women start feeling more safe to talk about the dynamics that they feel. It was a great discussion in my ward that Sunday. And it was amazing how many of the sisters, married, some single, all talked about how they feel like they can't be open about certain things and that they have to fit the cultural perspective. And so there's just a lot of things, I think, as we move in this new direction. I mean, now the women can serve in the Sunday school presidency. I just think there's a lot of movement to help sisters find that appropriate connection.
Yeah. Yeah. And that really feeds into positive culture, right? Mm-hmm. So that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I definitely want to maybe get a summary or a tease of these upcoming videos series that you put together. But is there any other point, principle, concept, story that we need to make sure we fit in at the end?
No, I think that's great. I appreciate your questions. And so like this coming Wednesday, we're probably going to present on the Great Divorce, and we're going to talk about why we're seeing that. Cool. We covered like I said, the faith, guilt, and shame. We'll go back through that one. We talked about how to not re-traumatize. We explained the window of tolerance so bishops understand what emotional dysregulation looks like and what emotional regulation looks like and how that may present in their offices. We're going to be talking about understanding that the spirituality and why there's that struggle sometimes. We're going to be talking about the dynamics of intimacy in the marriage, because right now, divorce rates are still at 50%. And there's so much misunderstanding about female sexuality and male sexuality and intimacy. We'll be covering that. We're going to talk about, leadership sustaining their own mental health and what that looks like. So we just have a lot of topics that we feel will be beneficial. It's going to be every Wednesday. Again, like I said, at 12 p.m. and 7 p.m. And we're even probably on the fourth Wednesday just going to be doing an open forum, an open discussion forum, so leaders can come with any dynamics. We've had some very interesting questions asked thus far by, like we had one bishop ask, how do I deal with an antisocial in my ward, And so it was a fun discussion to guide that bishop. So we're probably going to have an open forum like on the fourth Wednesday of every month. So
cool. That's awesome. Christy, thank you so much for this discussion. There's just so much to learn, and I'm excited that there's so many other topics that you can cover as well, and I think it'll bless our greater faith community. So,
thank you.